Hey, so this is the Drunkalogs, a podcast about addiction and recovery in which each guest shares their version of how it was, what happened, and how it is now, and then endures a half-hour Q&A at the hands of your host, Nick Morton. My next guest just wrote a book that feels both timely and profound. It is part memoir and part practical guide for, as its title suggests, how not to kill yourself. Its author tried to kill himself at least 10 times, but survived all those attempts to now chronicle his long struggle with suicidal ideation, as well as addiction to alcohol. His book proffers illuminating parallels between the impulse to obliterate yourself with booze and the impulse to end your life. My wife bought the book in part due to a recent epidemic of suicides at one of our children's schools. But when I read it, I was stunned and humbled to discover how similar the author's thinking is to my own, as rarely a day goes by that I don't think about doing myself in. Having read this book, though, I think about it less, and I believe the book and this conversation with its author offer valuable guidance for how to keep suicide at bay, even if just until tomorrow. I can't tell you how grateful I am for this book and for this rollicking conversation with its author. Won't you please welcome Clancy Martin. You grew up where exactly?
I grew up, I was born in Toronto, but I grew up in Calgary, Alberta. And I moved down to the States when I was a teenager because I kept getting kicked out of high school. And my mom got frustrated with me and first sent me down to live with my older brother, who was in the jewelry business in the States at the time.
And were you getting kicked out for drugs and alcohol or just being a crazy person?
First time was because I had pot in my locker, because I felt more secure keeping my pot in my locker than I did keeping it at home, which is telling. Well, also I was a teenager. I was incredibly stupid. But then it was for various kinds, because I was crazy. You know, I was just mostly just because I was refusing to go to school. One time because I threw a punch at a principal, just all kinds of nonsense. But I never graduated from high school.
Had you been using, like, by the time you were like thrown out, when did you like first like picked up a drink or drugs?
I think I first picked up a drink when I was quite young, after a cocktail party that one of my parents had thrown. But I didn't really, I didn't become. And I noticed as a teenager, and my friends noticed as a teenager, that I was different with alcohol than they were. I had already had blackouts as a teenager, and my friends would like tell me like, "Oh man, you were so crazy last night," that kind of thing. And I had some, weird teenage blackout experiences, waking up in people's beds, that sort of thing. But I didn't, but I didn't really get down to business about alcoholism until I was about 30. That's when I wasn't drinking during the day. I didn't even like to drink during the day. It seems totally bizarre to me now, but I had a kind of aversion to alcohol during the day until I was in my early 30s, and then I started getting into the real alcoholics pattern of waking up with a blistering hangover, going straight to the fridge, making sure that there was beer in the fridge for the next morning, and then going straight to the fridge. And if I had drunk all the beer in the fridge, first thing, as soon as I woke up, thinking, okay, where can I get a drink so that I can take the edge off before the day gets going, and getting sort of, in the pattern where I was regularly spending whole days, or most days, the vast majority of my days, in some stage of drunkenness.
And I guess, you talk in the book quite a bit about the parallels between suicidal thinking and addiction, and sort of like the mindset of addiction, I guess. And I'm curious, like, how old were you the first time you attempted to kill yourself?
I was 6 the first time I tried to kill myself, when I
6
planned it out and walked in front of a bus. Yeah.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah. And but my earliest memories include thoughts of wanting to kill. I mean, my very earliest memories like that are about noticing the color of the carpet and the feel of the carpet. So I was probably, 2 or younger, and having at the same time the desire to die, maybe not the desire to kill myself, but the desire, very strong, the desire to die. And then, as I grew up, it was just always there, just always there. This desire to kill myself. And when I first found out as a teenager, talking to my friends, that they didn't have this same, nonstop sort of desire all day long, wanting to kill themselves, I thought they were just lying. I didn't believe them. And as I slowly came to see that not everybody thought this way, I still thought that, I still very much was committed to this view that Richard Yates puts well, that, if we had a switch we could flip and end our lives, none of us would make it to 18. And I still wonder about that. But then, since this book has come out, I've met people who profess to me with complete sincerity that they've never once thought of taking their own lives, like never one time thought of it. And to me, this is just inconceivable. I can't even imagine what it would be like to have a brain where you never thought of taking your own life. Now, I was in a pitch of frustration, angry, worry, and anxiety about something quite recently, having right on the edge of what you would call a sort of minor panic attack. And normally in the past, that would totally be accompanied with a like, okay, I've got to take my own life now. I've got to kill myself. And in that moment, it wasn't. And it was so strange. And this has only happened in the past 6 months or so, maybe 9 months. My thinking has actually changed in the past 6 or 9 months for the first time in my life. And I was having this like minor panic attack, and I had no desire to kill myself. I had all the negative emotions that ought to go with the desire to kill myself, that have always gone with the desire to kill myself in the past. I had all those same emotions, and yet no desire to kill myself. It was weird. I was like, what am I supposed to do? Before, I always had an answer, like, oh, I know what I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to kill myself. I didn't have that anymore. And and I noticed it. I was like, I don't want to kill myself, even though I'm having all these horrible emotions. And I noticed how strange that was.
And what do you attribute that to?
I honestly attribute it, Nick, to the fact that I have just talked to, even before the book came out, the motivation for the book was an article I wrote that came out in HuffPo and a magazine called Epic at the same time about a couple of my suicide attempts. And people started reaching out to me then, and they said, I was Googling how to kill myself, and then I read your article and I decided not to. And that happens to you 50 or 100 times, and get even a skull as thick as mine, you start to realize, maybe I should tell the whole story. Since I only told a little slice of the story, maybe some other people can not kill themselves, and maybe I can help some people who just, help them avoid an attempt, or help them deal with the guilt and anxiety that follows from an attempt. So that's when I wrote the book. But since the book has come out, the number of conversations that I've had, and the number of people who have reached out to me, and who reach out to me every day, honestly, I was responding to someone's text probably 5 minutes before I got on the phone with you about her wanting to take her own life today, her desire to take her own life today, and trying to talk her through it a little. And I think that's what's done it more than anything, honestly, is just seeing so many people who want to die, and then trying to help them work through this, use the techniques that I use. And I think somehow it's like finally illuminated in my own mind that, there are other alternatives. I don't have just this one solution to my problems. And something deep in my belief structure has changed. It may change back, I knock on wood when I say this. But it's so much like sobriety. Like if you said to me right now, Clancy, I think you deserve a break, man. Let's and we were sitting together. Let's crack open a nice bottle of Beaujolais and have a glass of Beaujolais. I'd be like, be my guest, Nick. I hear you, but I have lost the desire for alcohol. And it's weird. If you had told me 15 years ago that you will wake up in the morning and you won't even want to drink anymore. It just won't, you won't want it anymore. I would have said, that's impossible. I'm going to die with the daily desire to drink. And you don't really know how it happened. It's just like suddenly it happens, and it's not that you don't still have the desire come into your mind. Speaking for me with alcohol, like if I'm in certain places, if I'm in an airport for too long, for example, and I see this people all having fun at this wine bar in the airport, I'll be like, oh, it does kind of look fun, doesn't it? or there are other circumstances, if I were alone in Paris and it was a really pretty day, I can imagine that it would be hard to walk by a bistro where I saw a bunch of people just kind of sitting outside in the sun, having a very civilized looking glass of wine. I can imagine that I'd be like, that does look nice. But it's not like this constant intrusive thought anymore, where it's like craving, wanting, needing. That's just gone. And the same thing seems to have happened with my suicidal thinking. And all I can do is be grateful for it. I can't really say for sure how it came to be.
It's interesting in the book. I mean, you talk. I mean, it's funny. I read the book knowing nothing about you, and I got I was maybe 12 pages in or something before I was like, oh, this thing feels like it's recovery. Like there's somehow this, the way Clancy talks about suicide just reminds me so much of recovery. And I wonder, and I can't remember now exactly what the parallel you made between addiction to wanting to kill yourself and addiction to drugs and alcohol was. I wonder if you could.
I really think that yeah, absolutely. I really think they come from the same source, which is, the Buddha says there are three basic sources of suffering. One is fear, another is longing or desire, and the third is the annihilation of the self, the attempt to get away from yourself. And I think at the heart of all of my suicidal thinking was just like, I couldn't bear to be Clancy and all that goes with that, all self-loathing, self-disappointment, self-reproach, guilt, all the kind of mental struggles we all have to varying degrees, of course, along with, being a very anxious person, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that alcohol for me, and other drugs never really did it for me in the same way as alcohol. I searched for another drug that could do as good a job as alcohol, but none of them did as good a job as alcohol for me. Not even opioids. They're just like a minor version, a temporary version. It's just like a little killing myself,
Yeah.
And it was really that self-annihilation. 2 or 3 glasses of wine, and suddenly the smell of Clancy would lift, the burden of Clancy would lift, and then 6 or 7, and it's like, oh, I don't even have to be this guy at all anymore, and all of the loathsomeness of Clancy would just be gone, and that terrible stench of Clancy would just be gone. And I think my brain was just wired so that it knew falsely. I genuinely actually believe this to be false. I do not think that suicide, my own particular view is that our minds, our consciousnesses persist after death. And so I think I was profoundly and importantly mistaken in this view. But I think I had this deep-seated conviction that the way to finally get rid of Clancy was just to take my own life, and that it was just the most effective alcohol there was. And until I discovered alcohol, I didn't realize that could be a kind of like a minor variation on this theme. But then, of course, as you get deeper into your addiction to alcohol, speaking for myself and for countless other people who've experienced the same thing, unfortunately, it's the case that the alcohol is not only going to worsen your depression and anxiety, it's also definitely going to worsen your suicidal thinking and make a suicide attempt much more likely. So, which has also been true in my own life.
And
Not all of my last suicide attempts have been taken place while I was drunk. Some of them have been taken place during a really horrible hangover, but they've all been related to alcohol.
Oh, right. And I mean, I guess when I was drinking a lot, I was really mostly an alcoholic. But I would do bad things for which there would be horrible repercussions, and that would often scare me straight for a period of time. And I wonder if a failed suicide attempt has a similar effect on your life, that sort of sense of like, wow.
It has the exact same effect. It's a wonderful analogy that I wish I'd made in the book that I didn't make, but that's exactly right. And I think in a weird way, you can almost, I don't know if you know what I'm talking about when I say this, Nick, but you can almost in a weird way even get addicted to those bad after effects in a strange way. Like I remember with alcohol, I don't know if I felt this way after a suicide attempt, but I remember with alcohol sometimes feeling like, yeah, okay, now I've done it. Now there's no turning back. I'm in a mess this time. And this
is
weird this is the weird feeling of liberation that came with that. It was a horrible feeling, but also a kind of, yeah, the kind of relief in this feeling of this is the bottom. I've just fucked everything up so incredibly badly. And it does feel that way. People who think that suicide is a cry for help, of course it can be. But when it's dismissed in that way, what they don't realize is that most people, when they wake up from a suicide attempt, and wake up in the hospital or someone cuts them down from a rope or whatever it happens to be, they're not happy that their lives were saved. They're profoundly unhappy, profoundly disappointed, and they're thinking of this, just as you describe it, this huge mess that they have to deal with now, the psychiatric hospital, their friends, making excuses to their friends, their loved ones, saying like, no, well, I mean, all the lies you're going to have to tell, all the reparations you're going to have to, which is one of the reasons why people who make an attempt are at their most vulnerable the first few weeks after they get out of the hospital, which is something everyone should know who has a person they love in their life who's made a past attempt. When they get out of that hospital, they may be acting like they've really got their shit together, but they do not. That's when they are at their greatest danger of dying by suicide, is those first few weeks out of the hospital.
Wow, that's that's good to know. That's
really it's important to know.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I guess one thing I'm sort of curious about is in my long struggle with recovery in some ways, this notion of a higher power, I've sort of come to this conclusion, like that whatever, for in a lot of ways, like my higher power is this sort of notion of chaos, and that like I don't control what's going to happen to me, and I find there's a lot of relief in not having to be the guy driving the ship. Somebody else is, and it's his problem, not mine.
Yeah.
But you've somehow come to this belief in some sort of afterlife, and I wasn't totally clear from the book how you had come to that realization.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think part of it, honestly, was just that I was part of it surely comes from my upbringing, and my father was a great believer in reincarnation, and taught me that. Then I went through a period of years when I didn't believe in any of these things, and I was very much a person who just believed, what I think probably most people, particularly in the West today, believe, but maybe worldwide, that you're born, you get this little snapshot of somewhere between, well, who knows how many years, none of us know, but anyway, we're hoping for around 80 or 90 years, and then you're gone, and that's that. And then I met my present wife, Amy, and she wanted to take me on this long trip. She was getting ready to do this sort of pilgrimage of, she was a Buddhist, and she was getting ready to do this pilgrimage of Buddhist sites around India. And we had, just started dating at this point. And she said, "Do you want to come along on the trip?" And I was at a point where I could. And so I was like, yeah, that sounds like a lot of fun. I've always wanted to go to India. My dad went to India over and over again in his life and always said he was going to take me and never managed to. And I did. And then towards the end of this trip, we met this, I had the opportunity to meet this teacher of hers. And then after meeting this person within relatively short order, very short order, I became a Buddhist. And just central to the Buddhist belief structure is this idea that the mind persists after death. There's a very
sorry,
there's a tiny little subsect of Buddhists from Southeast Asia who didn't believe this, but for 99.99% of the world's history of Buddhist philosophy, they are committed to this view that the mind persists after death. So I was like, okay, well, this is my new situation.
I have to say, I found it a pretty compelling argument in the book for why not to kill yourself, in that, like, doing this damage to whatever it is that might continue in the hereafter can't possibly strategically be beneficial to where you're going to wind up next,
Yeah, well,
or at least that's the argument I took away from it.
I was going to say, I think that's the really important thing, for me. If consciousness continues after death, then it seems to me to be flagrantly obvious that this can't be a good transition to be making.
Right.
Like, this is definitely going to be harmful to your consciousness, this kind of an end. If you yourself don't believe that consciousness continues after death, are you at least willing to entertain the possibility that you don't know one way or the other? If you're willing to entertain the possibility that you don't know, because it seems to me that it would be weird to claim that you do know for certain that there is, who would make such a claim? On what basis could you say with complete certainty that you know this to be the case? So if you're willing to entertain the possibility that perhaps consciousness might, for all you know, continue after death, then that alone, as Hamlet famously says, but in sleep what dreams may come, those dreams should give you pause, as Hamlet says. So it seems to me like I talk about in the end of the book that for the first time I've been entertaining this idea of a good death and the distinction between a good death and a bad death. And don't you, in your heart of hearts, Clancy, really want to live a good life and have a good death? And it is in my power to some degree it's in my power certainly to give myself a bad death. Yeah. So why don't I opt not to give myself a bad death? Otherwise, I don't know what kind of a death I'm going to have. I'm hoping for a good death, but at least if I don't take my own life, I can guarantee that I won't, at least I won't have guaranteed myself that I'll have a bad death, which I think a violent death by one's own hand is just, in the vast majority of circumstances, there are exceptions to this rule, but in the vast majority of circumstances, it's not the best way to end your life,
Sure. In all of your suicide attempts, did you ever have one of those moments that people talk about where they have seen some sort of afterlife?
I never have had any kind of, I share this together with my hero, Rosemary Manning, who wrote a wonderful book under the pseudonym Sarah Davies called A Time and a Time, about two of her suicide attempts. And she says in both of her suicide attempts, there was just darkness. There was nothing there.
I've dreamt my own death a couple times now.
Have you?
Yeah,
Interesting.
and it's in both twice. I've had it. My consciousness continued. Just nothing
Really.
changed.
Yeah.
Nothing in
Nothing
the dream.
changed.
Nothing changed. I was like, oh wow, death is
Yeah.
just a continuation of life. It's just I'm no longer here. Well, it
Yeah.
doesn't make any sense, but that's the way it was.
Well, maybe it does make some sense. The Buddhist philosopher Thich Nhat Hanh says what we can't ever forget is that death is just another concept, and we're laying all these concepts on values on top of our actual experience, supposing that we know what comes, what these concepts and values commit us to, but they really are just concepts and values. So we don't actually. Um, we have all of this preconception about this event, but we don't really actually know much about it. We're just adding all this stuff to it. And when the great Buddhist philosopher Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche, when one of his students died by suicide, another one of his students was grieving the student who found him, and the Trungpa Rinpoche turned to his student and he said about their friend who died by suicide. He said, "Oh, he's just realizing right about now that nothing important has changed, that this hasn't improved the situation at all." Just like your dream, like
Right.
actually, as far as what is really important, nothing has changed except for maybe that your situation, like like when you wake up after a blackout, you're like, nothing has changed except things are slightly worse than they
Yeah,
were
yeah.
before.
I'm now less capable of dealing with my problems.
Yeah, my problems are a little bit worse than they were before.
Um, I'm curious about your professional life, and like, I mean, here you're a professor. Um, you open the book with this story of I think what is your last suicide attempt, and then going to work in its aftermath. And you obviously you're very open about your suicides and stuff. Like, does it make your professional, like the people that the administration, anxious to have someone of your mental state guiding?
Proclivity.
Yeah, like being a mentor to students, I
Yeah,
mean, it's
teaching
such a
students. Yeah.
complicated situation.
Yeah, no, it's been odd that people have been so incredibly kind, supportive, generous, and I haven't really ever felt like this was making people nervous. Maybe in a couple of cases, people have been a little bit, um, maybe it's been a little bit awkward, but uh, I haven't experienced anything like one would expect that you would
Right.
experience. I mean, I actually think if I came out with a really detailed memoir about what I was like as a drunk, probably people would have been more shocked and alarmed than they were about me coming out with this memoir about what I like as a suicidal person. And how do I explain that? I think that the culture is changing for the better when it comes to mental health, and people are realizing that this has much more in common with a physical disease than they had ever supposed. And I think that people recognize that the motivation is sincere. That the only reason this guy is willing to admit to all this is that he is actually trying, hoping to help other people, if only a little tiny bit. So I think that's part of it. And I think it's a little bit, honestly, it's a little bit like the story Mencius tells, the great Confucian philosopher Mencius tells about why he believes that humans are basically good. He says, if the how I know that humans are basically good is that if anyone tells you the story of a couple and their child fell into a well and drowned, any human being, doesn't matter who it is, that human being's heart will go out to that couple, and with sorrow, with sympathy, with compassion, and this for him is sufficient proof that human beings are basically good. And I agree with Mencius about this, and I think that the way that people have dealt with me since this memoir has come out has been further proof. Like, you know, people just, they actually care. They're like, oh yeah, okay, you're suffering, and you're willing to be honest about it, and we respect that, and we care, and we know that you are showing that same kind of care towards the students, and the students are probably, a lot of them, needing this kind of care.
Yeah, for sure. How
Yeah.
long have you been sober now?
I got sober for the first time, seriously, actually sober, in 2000, January 1st, 2000.
Mm-hmm.
So I haven't been drinking for 20, no, excuse me. This shows how committed I am to my sobriety. January 1st. Yeah, that's the average AA person. They will not make this mistake. January 1st, 2009.
Right.
So I haven't been drinking for 14 years. Now, the first 2 years of that sobriety, which were arguably the worst years of my life, I mean, just absolute living hell. But I was also, it was on the heels of a suicide attempt, and they just had me on way too many medications, and the medications were making things worse rather than better. But 2 years of absolute pure hell. The worst depression of my life. I did not take a drink for those 2 years. Then my first, like what would count as my first real relapse, was in like February or March. So I'd been sober at that point for about 26 months, something like that. And then what happened was I went through a solid year of relapsing, like a week or two not drinking, then 3 or 4 days drunk, a week or two not drinking, 2 or 3 days drunk, like that for a solid year. And then I started getting more back on path, as we would think about it in AA anyhow. So that my relapses became less and less and less frequent. But I didn't understand the phrase relapse as part of recovery for a long time. I only came to understand it through living it. And I am a very passionate advocate of this notion that relapse is part of recovery, I really think that part of addiction is this sort of on-off thinking, like either I'm an addict or I'm not an addict. Either I'm a drunk or I'm not, or I'm sober. Either I'm a user or I'm clean. I think that way of thinking about it helps to reinforce the pattern of addictive thinking. And I think this is true of not just our relationship with whatever our drug of choice is, but with all kinds of different addictions that we have in our lives, whether it's to other people or to our phones or to spending or exercise or whatever it happens to be. And that we have to start to realize that it's much more of a continuum than that. And so that if I were to leave this conversation and walk to a bar and have 3 beers and then call my wife Amy and say, I don't know how it happened, but I wound up walking into a bar and having 3 beers, I would not feel like that was necessarily, I mean, it's not something that I want to have happen, but I wouldn't feel like it was the end of the world or such a big deal. I'd just be like, oh, well, tomorrow's a new day.
I think that's, it's funny. I remember now that you're talking about this in the book that, my first couple of years of sobriety, I would have this recurring dream where I would have a drink. And so much of the regret I felt over the drink was of losing my time in recovery, which is so silly, like
so crazy.
Like who cares? And I have a friend I play tennis with all the time who's a recovering heroin addict, and like I remember he and I would go to meetings together, and then he told me this story. He's like, oh yeah, last night I had a drink, and I'm like, it just seemed crazy. like are you for real? Like, and like he's like, yeah, alcohol's never really been a problem for me, and I'm like, well, that's interesting. I mean. And I think there is some gray area that is going unexplored about like, well, what are your what things really are a problem for you. And if there is a sort of a more holistic approach to looking at addictive behavior and the stuff that is damaging and that is not damaging. And I don't know, Russell Brand has a great book that I know he's someone that we're not allowed to talk about right now anymore, but he called Recovery, where he just sort of puts the 12 steps in layman's terms and sort of as a way to sort of look at all kinds of your behavior and be like, well, is this something that I can apply to, as you say, the way I use my phone or the way I interact with people? Or God, for me right now, the way I play tennis, I played tennis on Friday for 6 hours. Like like, that's not healthy.
Yeah,
it was like
you're a little bit
I was
of
at a full on like
right
tennis
now.
orgy.
Yeah.
So when was the last time you attempted suicide?
The last time I attempted suicide was more than 5 years ago. And but the daily urge, as I was saying, the daily urge to kill myself, or is just like, always part of my thinking. That only changed about maybe a few months before this book came out, and then since the book came out. So it's been about 9 or 10 months since the daily urge, and that's still an ongoing thing. But I would now say that, miraculously, whole days go by without me. Miraculously, I honestly, I still can't believe it. The whole days go by without without the thought even coming into my head. It sometimes makes me feel a little disingenuous when I'm trying to help people who I know are dealing with daily suicidal ideation, and I want to say, yeah, I totally know how you feel, because I remember what it's like very vividly, but I've lost a little bit of the feeling of it. It's weird. I don't miss it.
It's interesting when we first started this conversation, and you said that you had just been texting with somebody who was, struggling with suicidal impulses. And it occurred to me that, like, oh, this is like maybe a burden that you have inadvertently taken on. I mean, I feel it sometimes with this podcast. Like, I am not an addiction specialist, and people reach out to me all the time to talk about addiction. And I'm like, this is not, I don't want to be responsible necessarily for giving good or bad advice.
You don't feel qualified, and et cetera, et cetera. Yeah,
but
I understand.
Then it occurred to me as you were talking that I wonder if this like relentless element of service that has come with this book has served to enhance your recovery in some way.
I think that's exactly right. I think that's what it's been. I think more than anything else. At first, I thought, as I was thinking about it, I thought, oh, it's because I've confronted all these things about myself, and I finally put all these things out there that I was afraid to put out there. And that may have helped. But I was not quite convinced by that, because I've never been much of a person for, like, I've been willing to put a lot of stuff on the page ever since I've been a writer. So I wasn't completely convinced that that was right. And Lord knows it didn't have that effect with alcohol. Writing about my alcoholism really did not help liberate me from my addiction to alcohol. And more and more, I've come around to this view that you just articulated, that better than I did, that it's just been like, I might not have chosen this level of service, honestly, partially because I don't think I would have felt like I was up to the task, but also because I just like, holy Moses, I didn't know what I was getting myself into, but here I am. And now what am I supposed to do? I like you, what are you supposed to do? People need the help. You're going to try to help them. I mean, it's more important than whatever else you're doing. Lord knows. And so you wind up doing all of this service, and it has this weird magic. I think
it is. I mean, I do think. I mean, it's such a hard thing to proselytize about without sounding so sort of smug.
Yeah, you don't want to sound self-congratulatory, exactly.
But I mean, I've also found that, like, sometimes I've not been the greatest at service in recovery. I'm not very helpful to other addicts.
Me neither. Yeah.
But I have found that, like, if I go help in any other kind of capacity, whether it's struggling screenwriters or it's homeless, like just working in my local soup kitchen, that it is like, I mean, it's such a miraculous source of relief. I can't even
relief.
Look, I know you have a time constraint, and I don't want you to be completely frenzied when you're going into your next meeting, but I do feel like if there was anything additional from your book that might be helpful to share for people who might just listen to this podcast and not bother to pick up the book, though you're really making a mistake if you choose that path, is your 9 sort of, I think it was 9, it was sort of a list you have in the book of things that you can do to help you not kill yourself. And I don't know if you could rattle through that in 5 minutes, or if it's available somewhere online to look up or something. I don't know, but
there were 10 actually, but then my editor had me take prayer out of there because she thought that I was insufficiently articulate about prayer. So she was like, could we lose the prayer one? And I was like, yeah, that's fine. We can lose the prayer one. The one thing that I would say, above all others from that list of 9 things, it includes patience, trying to cultivate, suicidal people tend to be very, very impatient people, trying to cultivate patience and recognizing that your patience is intimately connected with your anger, which Shantideva, one of the great Buddhist philosophers, taught us more than 1,000 years ago, that the real opposite of patience isn't impatience. The real opposite of patience is anger. If you can try to work on your anger, you will become a much less suicidal person. But the one thing that I would really like to stress to people is you have to recognize at some point, you have to recognize that there is such a thing as your spiritual nutrition, and you have to be willing to take responsibility for your own spiritual nutrition. And until you take responsibility for your own spiritual nutrition, you're never going to give yourself the chance to flourish in the way that you can. And what do I mean about spiritual nutrition? Well, it's simple. There are some foods that are better for you, and there are some foods that are worse for you. There's some climates that are better for you. There's some climates that are worse for you. There's some books that are better for you. There's some books that are worse for you. There's some friends that are better for you. There's some friends that are worse for you. There may be some drugs that are better for you if you have a psychiatrist, and drugs that are worse for you. And there are attitudes also that are better for you and attitudes that are worse for you. And you have to be willing to apply that kind of nuance and care to your psychological well-being. No one else is going to be able to do it for you. Now, having a therapist may be part of that spiritual nutrition, but that therapist is just a part of that spiritual nutrition. You've got to really take care of the whole inner you and recognize what actually helps you and what actually harms you. And until you do that, no one else is going to be able to do that for you. No psychiatrist, no therapist, no friend, no spiritual leader, nobody is going to be able to do that for you. So try to take as much care of yourself as your inner self, as you spend taking care of your outer self and your bills and the people around you and the way you dress and your exercise routine and whatever. And if you find that jogging is better for you than running, then jog. If you find that walking is better for you than jogging, then walk, whatever it is. If you don't go on living, you're not going to be able to do any of these things. And then always try to remember that there is nobody stopping you from killing yourself tomorrow. So if you wait a day, not only is it a free day, you can do whatever you want today, but you could go out there and you could smile at somebody who isn't expecting a smile, and you could totally change their day for the better. And suddenly there's some goodness in the world that wouldn't have existed were it not for you. And if you can remember that you have even that tiny little thing is your ability to create a little goodness in the world, then maybe you can remember that you're not so loathsome, that the world does need you, that you can be, you are adding value to the world, and you're not this despicable person that people would be better off without. They want you around, whether you know it or not. And finally, if you're really feeling in crisis, reach out to someone. The last time I was in a really rough spot was about a year and a half ago, and I didn't know who I could turn to because I was in the middle of this book about suicide, and I felt like, it was all too raw for the people around me. So I couldn't reach out to my wife. I couldn't reach out to my friends. They all knew I was working on this book about suicide. I didn't feel like I could even reach out to my editor because I felt like that would influence the way she was thinking about the book. I texted my roofer. My roofer seemed like an amiable guy. And so I sent him a text and I said, "Hey man, I'm having a really rough day. How's your day going?" And he texted me back. And then we just texted back and forth a little bit about, yeah, life is really hard sometimes. Sometimes you're having a really rough day. And then we signed off like, "Hey, thanks for texting me, man. You helped me out." And I was like, "Yeah, you helped me out too, man. Thanks a lot." And that was what got me through, that reaching out as simply as that. So, yeah, those are the things I want to say to people who are struggling. And if someone reaches out to you, let me tell you, keep them talking and get them walking, because they need to get out of the physical space they're in. The physical space they're in is bad for them right now. And if you can keep them talking, don't try to fix their problems. Don't try to offer them any solutions or anything like that. Just get them talking, keep them talking, let them pour it out, and just keep listening. I have a 5-year-old and a 1-year-old, and there is this book I was reading to them a few nights ago. And in the book, this child is very upset because she's made a little art object, and it's fallen apart. And so she's really, really upset. And first the lion comes, and the lion says, "I know what we can do. We can attack this problem," but attacking the problem doesn't work. And then the bear comes, and the bear says, "I know what we can do. We can scare away this problem." And the bear roars, but the roaring doesn't work. And then a beaver comes, and the beaver says, "I know what we can do. We can fix this problem." And the beaver tries to fix the problem, but that doesn't work. And then a mouse comes, and the mouse says, "I know what we can do. We can hide from this problem." But again, hiding from the problem doesn't work. And then a rabbit comes, and the rabbit just cuddles up with the child, and it doesn't say anything at all. And then from cuddling up with the child finally starts to talk to the rabbit. And then the rabbit just listens to the child. And then through listening, then finally the rabbit says, "Okay, now we can." And this is, of course, what works, And if someone reaches out to you, that's what you've got to be. You've got to be that rabbit that just snuggles up to the person and is willing to keep on snuggling and is willing to listen. And you will save people's lives that way.
Well, Clancy, I mean, this has been amazing. Really, truly, so thankful that you came on this podcast and made time for it. The book really has changed my life, and thanks for sharing some wisdom with me. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Nick. I totally enjoy it. Couldn't have enjoyed our conversation more, and I'm so glad we did this over Zoom, because for your listeners, you have to take the time to Google up a picture of Nick Martin, because something about his gaze is very reassuring about life. You'll feel better about life just by looking at his face. I feel like I've made a new friend, so I'm really grateful.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening. You can support this podcast at patreon.com/thedrunkalogs.